Do you agree that The Lodger is it's the first of your films that can properly be called a Hitchcock film? I mean.
The Lodger is the first true Hitchcock film, and the story of its creation is the story of a remarkable director and the power of film.
The Lodger was his third film as a director. He'd worked on a bunch of films before that in various capacities. It's the first crime picture he made.
This is where the imprint, the Hitchcock mark, is first seen.
It's the first one that you can feel engaged him entirely.
The Lodger is a film that has many characteristic Hitchcock qualities to it.
There are certain themes he returned to quite often: mistaken identity, the wrong man.
Who does not feel at one point in their life or other, over matters great or matters small, that they have been wrongly accused of having done something?
Hitchcock was very interested in these situations where we're motivated to do things that we shouldn't do out of guilt, or to feel a certain way because of guilt.
And then, of course, we come to the idea of blonde women. That's a major hallmark of Hitchcock films, the blonde heroine.
He said to me, this was off camera, he said, you got the cool blonde thing going. Well, he said, they're very cool and elegant. But he says, you got to think that they would really be pretty hot if they were left to their own device. And kind of go,
In The Lodger, we have a very attractive single-named actress named June, who plays Daisy. Very great name for a woman who could be plucked at any moment by a killer. Staircase is just a staircase. In Hitchcock films, staircases are never just staircases.
And then there's the famous shot of the hand going down the stairs, just the hand.
Something as simple as someone walking down a staircase becomes, in The Lodger, an act full of menace and potential horror, just as at the end of Notorious, in which two characters walk down a staircase, becomes full of suspense and drama and romantic meaning and complexities of all different kinds.
Hitchcock also loved to promote himself. The whole business with him doing cameos, I think that was a wink at not only the audience, but at the whole film industry, saying, this is my movie, folks.
I think it's really telling and really important that Hitchcock's cameo in The Lodger, the very first of the cameo appearances that he makes in any film, shows him in a newspaper office, as if he's saying, hey, look, I'm part of this world too, in which we're disseminating stories, narratives, which really people are fascinated by.
And that was done because we just, in a scene of that kind, we didn't even bother to engage actors, So all right, boys, all sit down in the newspaper office,
And so you decided from then on to appear in all of them?
Yeah.
And have you appeared in all since then?
Nearly all, yes. I can't remember the ones I have on desk.
At the end of the movie, during the chase, there's a scene of some people around a bridge attacking the Lodger, and many people believe that one of the people in the crowd is Alfred Hitchcock.
It's also a Hitchcock film, very much so, in that it's got the big set piece. It's got a climax that's terrific Hitchcock. The way that it builds from this very closed, almost claustrophobic personal story to this wonderful scene in the pub that goes out into the streets with this mob chasing the guy down the street. I mean, it's quite amazing in terms of the big payoff.
But these are all just little touches. The things that make us come back to a Hitchcock film over and over and over are the things that he was able to put into it, the personal drama, the way he's able to put us inside a character. But to really understand what makes these films work, you have to understand the filmmaker behind them. You have to learn more about how this young director became the master of suspense.
Alfred Hitchcock was born in 1899 in Britain, near London. He came from a middle-class family, people who were greengrocers, actually.
He was born in a lower-class Catholic family in England, where it's not easy to be Catholic. It's a Protestant country, it's a minority.
As a boy, Hitchcock was very obese, and as you might imagine, this made him something of an outcast. It didn't help either that his family was Roman Catholic, and this is when Britain was still very, very Protestant. So Hitchcock went to a Jesuit school where, as he told Francois Truffaut, as a young boy he never really had any playmates. He also said that when he would go to family gatherings, he would just kind of sit in a corner and observe. And from all those years of sitting back and observing human nature and what was going on around him, he learned a lot about how people interact with each other, and these are the things that he put into his movies that make them compelling to this day.
He mythologized to a certain extent his past, as perhaps all of us do.
The result is that we, as a public, have a number of stock stories about Hitchcock that we're never ever certain if they were actually true.
One of the stories that he told again and again was the time he was naughty and his father arranged to have him arrested.
I suppose I must have been at the age of 5 when I was sent along with a note to the chief of police, who read the note, then promptly put me into a cell and locked the door.
And you hadn't read
for
the
5
note?
minutes. No, I hadn't read the note. And
for 5 minutes?
yes, and then said, that's what we do to naughty little boys, you see.
My sisters and I used to say, well, that's cruel, that's horrible. And he said, well, it was at the time, and he never did get over the fact that he always was petrified of policemen.
He left school early because his father got sick and died, and he had to be the breadwinner of the family.
Very early on, Hitchcock was writing short stories. And if you read those short stories, they're very cinematic. So I clearly think that there was a bubbling under the surface that potentially he could see for himself that this could be a career for him.
Alfred Hitchcock left home at the age of 18 and went to work in a company that made electric cables, took some art courses, ended up in the advertising department.
Then in 1919, when he heard that Famous Players Lasky, which was a division of Paramount, was going to be making movies in Britain, he decided he would go to Famous Players with his portfolio and try to get a job. So he read in a trade journal that they were going to be doing The Sorrows of Satan, which was a popular novel. So he didn't have a copy of the script, but he got the novel, and reading through the novel, he made up a whole set of title cards, staying up all night for several nights to do this. So then when he goes in and shows these to the people from Famous Players Lasky, they were very impressed, and they gave him a job.
Vital to Hitchcock's career was his wife, Alma, who he met in his early 20s when he was working on his very first films.
Alfred Hitchcock was really happy to find Alma Rebel, both professionally and personally.
She was actually in many ways his superior at first, in his first few years in the film business.
He went to work at a place called Islington, and she'd already been there 4 years working on films.
I mean, she was editing film, she was a writer, she was kind of a jack of all trades.
They began to work together, and all the way through his entire career, she was his support system.
He just completely respected her opinion, and she would give it. She would not be afraid to just tell him, this is a horrible story, I would never make a good movie, or yes, yes, you should do this, this would be good. And she had comments about casting and writers and all of that, and he really, really respected everything she would say, and he listened to everything she said. She was 4'11" in height, but she was just as strong as could be.
He never thought he was going to be a director.
He was a young assistant director. He had learned production design, which was sort of his special skill, and also screenwriting, and he was doing all of this for a man named Graham Cutts. And he was doing it all under the aegis of Michael Balcon, who was the greatest English producer of his generation, who can claim to have discovered Hitchcock.
That Balcon is really the man responsible for Hitchcock, basically, because, oh yes, at the time, I had been a writer, a script writer, and on every picture I used to write the script, and then at the end of that job I turned over and became art director and production designer, or whatever it was in those days. And then I did that for several pictures until one day he said the director, I worked with the same director all the time, didn't want me anymore. Balcon obviously was in a spot with the director. If the director said he didn't want me, well, that was that. But Balcon obviously felt that one's talent existed and had not changed, And it was he who suggested that I become a director.
Had you just intended to go on doing...
Oh, I was very content for the time, yes.
Writing scripts and designing?
Yes, I enjoyed it very much.
When he was directing his first two feature films, which were The Pleasure Garden and The Mountain Eagle for Gainsborough, Gainsborough had set up a film unit in Germany.
The German connection was very important to Hitchcock.
Germany at that time was kind of a film mecca. That's where the most interesting films are coming from, directed by people such as G.W. Pabst and F.W. Murnau and Fritz Lang.
Hitchcock had the really wonderful opportunity of working in Germany in the mid-1920s, right during the high point of what we might call German Expressionism or Weimar cinema.
This enabled Hitchcock to observe both Fritz Lang and F.W. Murnau, the two great Expressionist directors. He was on the set. He talked to Murnau on the set of The Last Laugh, or Der letzte Mann, which was one of the breakthrough films.
The Last Laugh is one of the all-time classics of cinema. It's a silent film with no intertitles whatsoever, so it's a completely visual film. Hitchcock took all that in, and you can see the influence of that in The Lodger, which looks very much like these German expressionistic films, even to the style of the lettering and its intertitles.
Furthermore, in the German cinema of that period, there was not quite such an emphasis on realism, but they were often using the cinema to show psychological states and subjective perspectives, and that would be very, very important in many Hitchcock films.
The Lodger was the first story. He went to Michael Balcon and said, "Look, I'd like to make this." He had grown up not far from where Jack the Ripper operated. It wasn't that long afterwards that he was born. So it was part of the lore of his neighborhood.
The movie The Lodger is based on the book The Lodger by Marie Belloc Lowndes.
There was an urban legend that was floating around about a landlady who thought her lodger was Jack the Ripper. This was told to Marie Belloc Lowndes at a dinner party by an unidentified gentleman. She wrote a story called The Lodger and then a novel. It became a bestseller.
The star of The Lodger is a remarkable man who was born as David Ivor Davies on January 15, 1893. He was a prodigy in music. He went to Oxford for a while, and very early in his career he started composing songs, and in 1915, he wrote a song that became one of the great, one might say, leitmotifs or theme songs of the Great War. Keep the Home Fires Burning.
He wrote musicals, he wrote songs, he was a performer. Largely in the British stage.
When silent film was coming along, he was cast in the early 1920s because he was so devastatingly handsome in a few silent pictures, and very, very quickly became a big matinee idol in British film.
In the original book and play of The Lodger turns out to be probably the murderer. But because Ivor Novello was playing the part, and because he was so popular with a legion of female fans, that just wasn't going to be the way that the producers were going to allow the film to end.
This condition, of course, is one of the commercial drawbacks one encountered. Of course, strictly speaking, he should have been the Ripper and gone on his way. That's how Mrs. Lowndes, Belloc Lowndes, wrote the book. But of course, having Ivor Novello, the matinee idol of the period, he had to be cleaned up, just as I had to do it with Cary Grant in Suspicion many, many years later. So obviously, putting that kind of actor into those sort of films is a mistake, because you just have to compromise.
So in other words, the audience immediately knows he couldn't be.
Yeah, sure.
The studio didn't want their handsome leading man to be guilty of a murder. Apparently, they thought even fictional guilt would taint their reputations.
And so he had to end up being a kind of red herring. Now, for Hitchcock, I'm sure this was a disappointment. All through his career, he loved to subvert our expectations.
One of the things that Alfred Hitchcock was absolutely brilliant at was making a silent film that seems like a sound film.
When you see the faces of the women who are being killed, you don't need to hear their anguished cries. You do hear them, because the way those faces are lit and the contortions of their faces are so extreme and so gripping and so beautifully shot.
When the lodger walks in the door, a cuckoo clock pops open and goes cuckoo, cuckoo. We can't hear it because it's a silent film, but cuckoo means the same thing in British as it does in American. It means this guy's crazy.
One of the unique scenes in The Lodger is, of course, when the Avenger is, or alleged Avenger, is pacing upstairs.
Hitchcock shoots it through a sort of a plate glass floor, so you can see the. But obviously, they're not living in a house with a plate glass floor. This is an expressionist technique to illustrate his anxiety, and they're being bothered by it.
This is what the Germans called the shot of mental content.
Ways of expressing, a character state of mind. So they were trying to find cinematic equivalents for expressing the character state of mind, and I think this is why this comes to fruition in Hitchcock's work in The Lodger.
This is the kind of thing that Hitchcock later became very famous for, and he said early on that he put in scenes like this because they were the ones that the critics tended to comment on. They were the things that grabbed the critic's attention. And so it didn't much matter what the critic thought of the film. When the film was considered retrospectively by the critic thought, oh, that exciting moment outside the bathroom.
Another thing that happens in The Lodger, the ambiguity of the people. The people are not simple in Hitchcock. They are very ambiguous. The most interesting character is Joe, the detective. Older man, stodgy. He's in love with Daisy. And Daisy's affections have now gone over to the lodger.
It's audacious because of the way in which it undermines the authority of the police by taking a figure of authority and making him a thoroughly unsympathetic character, by making him kind of a domineering brute.
Throughout The Lodger, Hitchcock handles Novello in such a way as to raise suspicion as to who he is, and indeed to suggest that he might well be the Avenger. So that Hitchcock, in retrospect, playfully, is making the audience wonder, along with everyone else in the film except Daisy, whether the Avenger is living upstairs.
He's suspected of being a serial killer. But as a matter of fact, he is bent on murder. He is out to murder someone.
The lodger himself is trying to avenge the death of his sister, and the audience's sympathy ends up with him. There's often this sharing of guilt then, as Hitchcock's movies move through their dramatic arc.
That's audacious, and that's the first time that Hitchcock plays those games in order to make us feel these sort of creepy things that we feel. Hitchcock's films are intended to make us feel.
I see all the way through Hitchcock the MacGuffin. The MacGuffin is something we may not even see, but it's what makes the whole film go. And the first MacGuffin, we tend to forget, was a person, the Avenger, whom we never see.
We learn off screen that this guy, they caught the guy. So we have this very interesting twist at the end, and we realize that this thing that's been driving the whole story, right, the pursuit of this Avenger, the thing that all the characters care about and that drives the story, but ultimately the spectator, it's not where our investment is in terms of what's happening in the story. And that of course, is very Hitchcockian.
And in the last shot, we see a sign outside his window that says, "Tonight, golden curls, tonight, golden curls." That's the sign flashing on and off that begins the movie, and the golden curls are the Avenger's obsession. He only strangles blondes.
It's a weird, weird, weird narrative, and it's great as a weird, weird narrative.
There's certain religious imagery in The Lodger. Hitchcock is going to make you wonder, is the man guilty? Is he not guilty? Is this an evil person that we're looking at?
At the end of The Lodger, some people might draw parallels with the crucifixion and almost Christ-like images of him almost impaled up there like Jesus on the cross.
he gets caught and he's hanging there. And he is, you know, he's Christ incarnate.
When Hitchcock finished The Lodger, strangely enough to modern eyes, within the studio there was a kind of debate about whether this film should even be released.
There were two main enemies of this film, C.M. Wolfe, who controlled domestic distribution, and Graham Cutts.
Graham Cutts was a director, and Hitchcock had been his assistant director in the 1920s on two films. One was called Woman to Woman, and the other was called The White Shadow.
C.M. Wolfe blamed Hitchcock for what was known as the White Shadow incident. And the White Shadow had been a film, 1924, that everyone inside the studio thought would make an incredible amount of money. Hitchcock had been the assistant director, scenic artist, and co-screenwriter of this project, so his fingerprints are basically all over this film, The White Shadow. It had been hyped as from the same director, producer, assistant director, scenic artist as Woman to Woman. But when the film came out, it was a complete disaster. Audiences and critics hated it. C.M. Wolfe blamed Hitchcock for putting all of these artistic pretensions in this film. He saw a lot of this while The Lodger was in production and thought that they were going to have another big disaster on their hands.
So C.M. Wolfe and Graham Cutts, who both had an interest in Gainsborough, tried to block the release of The Lodger, and in so doing could have blocked Hitchcock's whole directing career.
Producer Michael Balkin steps in, and he brings in Ivor Montagu, who ran the Film Society, and he had been greatly influenced by the Soviet filmmakers and had written at length about them. And he came in and did a lot of editing work on the film and really helped bring the final product to the screen.
When the film was released, it became one of the biggest hits in Britain.
And it sealed Hitchcock as one of the greatest directors of the British cinema.
The Lodger was considered in its day to be the first great English film.
Quite simply, it's a brilliant, beautiful, imaginative, elegant movie.
Hitchcock is probably one of the three most important of the directors who changed the way in which cinema works and who showed countless directors who followed them what it was that cinema could be.
Hitchcock, you know, remains the great English director.
He was one of those who made the whole world realize how important the director is, because there's simply no doubt when you're watching a Hitchcock film that it's a Hitchcock film. It doesn't matter what studio it came from, it doesn't matter if it's from Britain or the United States, it doesn't matter who produced it. Hitchcock's films are pure Hitchcock.